G. Michael Vasey with another episode of The Magical World of G. Michael Vasey. Well, today I'm going to be interviewing Anthony Peake. Anthony Peake grew up on the Wirral near Liverpool, England. He was educated at Wirral Grammar School, Warwick University and the London School of Economics. He's a member of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, the Scientific and Medical Network and Society for Psychic Research. I first met Anthony sort of indirectly when I was asked by his publisher of his first book, Is There Life After Death?, to write a review. I read the book and I was really taken with it. It was an extraordinary piece of work. I followed Anthony and corresponded with him for a few years thereafter, reading his books, The Demon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, and several of his other books. I've watched as Anthony has migrated through a variety of paranormal type topics, including time, out-of-body experiences, and even wandered into the area of the paranormal with opening the doors of perception, the key to cosmic awareness. And just recently, he came out with The Hidden Universe, an investigation into non-human intelligences. And I realized that he and I were on a similar trek. And so it's with great delight that I managed to get Anthony to talk to me earlier today. And what follows is an extraordinary interview, in my opinion. Please enjoy Anthony Peake.
Well, I suppose in terms of my writing career and my interest, it's something that I've been fascinated in since childhood, really. I've always been interested in the esoteric. I've always been interested in the mysterious. But unusually, I've always been interested in the explanations for these experiences. I've never been one for just being fascinated by out-of-body experiences, UFO encounters, precognitions, these type of things. I've always wanted to seek out answers. And like yourself, I'm of a very scientific bent. So my approach has always been the science, explain it, the science first, and see if you can explain it scientifically, and then move it from there. From quite an early age, when I'd had a series of rather peculiar hallucinations during a bout of double pneumonia when I was 12 years of age. And at that stage, the whole thing that fascinated me was what was taking place in my conscious awareness, whereby I was seeing things that clearly were not out there in three-dimensional reality that anybody else was seeing, but I was seeing them quite clearly. And it began a great interest in me about the interface between consciousness and external reality. When I went off to university in the early 1970s, I was given the opportunity to do a dual honours degree, so I was able to focus in both on the historical aspects of extraordinary human experiences and also the sociological aspects of these experiences. So, for example, I was long fascinated by schismatic religious beliefs, particularly focusing in on a lot of the interesting religions and belief systems that came out of the English Civil War, and also in your part of the world after the 30 Years' War. From there became some quite interesting religious groups, and I became intrigued by some of the mystics of that period, and also the way in which Kabbalistic belief systems came up through Andalusian Spain, and also writers and thinkers such as Jacob Boehme and various other individuals. So I was intrigued by the mixtures of these two and why it was that people believed the efficacy of a lot of the magical techniques, because clearly if they didn't work, they wouldn't have pursued them, particularly within the periods of the Enlightenment. I always wanted to write a book, and I had lots of ideas buzzing around in my mind. And I was fortunate in the late 1990s, whereby I'd done a business contract in Warsaw, and I'd done a little bit of work out there, and I had sufficient money to be able to take a year out to write a book. And at the end of that year, I'd written my first book, Is There Life After Death? The Extraordinary Science of What Happens When We Die. And as they say, the rest was history, because that book is still selling now. It's extraordinary how many copies that book has sold, considering it's not really been heavily advertised. It's not with a big publisher. It's with a publisher who has backed the book throughout the years, and I'm very happy that Arcturus did that for me. But it still sells, and it's still my biggest selling book. That was what motivated me. I'm always somebody that's looking after answers. And I believe that we are here to learn, and our role in life is to pursue what it is, what I am, and what it means to be something perceiving something, I suppose.
As you say, we're both from a scientific background, and to some extent, what we're both investigating and talking about is belief-based to a large degree. There's a dichotomy there, isn't there, between science and belief? How do you rationalize that as you approach topics like entities and ghosts and the paranormal and so on and so forth?
Well, I suppose my philosophy on this has always been based upon one or two simple premises, whereby, for instance, I always focus in on the word empirical. Now, the word empirical means from experience. So when somebody says that you need to prove something empirically, what it effectively means is that you need to prove it from your own experience. Now, the scientific method, which has done so well for human civilization, is based upon the idea that you observe something and then you try to repeat it under controlled conditions. And if you manage to repeat it, you'll then manage to take it apart using the materialist reductionist model of taking it down into its component parts, analyzing those parts and seeing how they interact and interface together to create whatever phenomenon you're looking at. But the problem with this is that it doesn't necessarily work for actual experiences. We all have, or many of us in our lives have, extraordinary experiences that cannot be explained using the present scientific paradigm. Precognitions, lucid dreaming, out-of-the-body experiences, these type of things, which are regularly recorded across every society and through all historical periods. Now, these things are real in the sense they are sociologically real, they are experientially real, in that if we take what quantum physics tells us about the true nature of reality and perceptual reality, what is real is what we perceive.
Yeah.
And my developing model, which I'm calling the egregorial model, or actually now I'm actually calling the cosmic anthropological egregorial model, is that what we perceive and what our senses interpret is effectively there's a one-to-one relationship between our perceptions and what is externally out there. And there seems to be some form of symbiotic relationship taking place here. For example, I've always been intrigued as a sociologist as to why it is that people so tenaciously hold on to what seems to be irrational beliefs to other individuals. And I'm coming to the conclusion the reason is that within their phaneron, within their worldview, and the feedback mechanism they get from the external world is that their beliefs are vindicated by the things they experience. You know, if you believe in certain things, your world seems to reflect those beliefs back at you.
Absolutely.
And that's long intrigued me as to why that is.
And this is the basis, along with some of the other things you've already said, for books that I've written, like How to Create Your Own Reality. And it's based on the idea that by how you are in the beginning, and then how you were raised and how you become, and through what lenses you look, you see a world. But that reflects back to you what you already are. And so if you can understand who you are, know thyself, and act in a certain way, you can change that external world how you want it to be, and that's what I call magic. Another way of thinking about that is, it's to whatever I give my attention, I give my energy, and if I expect something to be some certain way, then it will be. Because I'm giving it my energy, I'm energizing it. I see you heading in a very, or at least I think you're heading in a very similar direction. Maybe I'm doing this to myself because that's what we're talking about. But I think we're heading in a very similar direction. And I think magic and quantum physics, I would say the quantum physics people should read some of the early magicians and alchemy stuff because they're talking the same thing. Where did this come from, this thinking, this way of looking at the world? So I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I wonder if, given any thought to the idea of where you give your attention has importance.
The more I write, and the more I read, and the more I research, the more I'm coming to the conclusion that there is something at a much deeper level in terms of how the phenomenal world works with the act of the observer. And as you say, attention. And I think attention is one of the most powerful things. It's to attend to something in the external reality. And I've noticed in my own life, I tend to be the glass is half empty type individual.
Yeah.
And I note that if I am feeling down or negative, the world around me becomes down and negative. Things don't work for me. But you're then in those those zones when everything just seems to go right. When you're feeling good about the world, you seem to attract or create an egregorial reality that reflects your mood.
Yeah.
And suddenly the things just work for you. And it is extraordinary how much that happens. But it is also extraordinary how, even though I witness that taking place, that doesn't override my own instinctive pessimism about things, if that makes sense. I should be learning from this and think positively, and things will work out in some way. But it's very difficult to break out of your own worldview, and that does intrigue me. But I'm very much coming to the, as you say, the magical viewpoint of things, without ever having to abdicate my interest in science. Because the more I understand about quantum mechanics, and like yourself, I mean, I invest a great deal of time really, really understanding quantum mechanics. And of course, the argument is, as people like Niels Bohr has said, that if you make out that you understand quantum physics, you self-evidently haven't. Right. And I think my argument here is that I understand the implications of what quantum mechanics are telling us about the nature of reality. And it comes very much into magical thinking, the idea of the way the act of observation seems to collapse the statistical wave function into point particles. Now that is magic, isn't it? That is what exactly magic says. You focus in on something and you make it happen. And again, I'm reminded here of a quote by Jacob Boehme, which stuck to my mind really powerfully. It said you could go insane by just looking at a pewter dish, because you start to really look at exactly what something is, rather than your impressions of it and what your education tells you as to what it's all about, if that makes any sense at all.
It does, because in magical training, you spend hours and hours and hours doing exactly that, by the way. Empty-minded meditation, or focus on a particular object so they can see it in total clarity in the mind's eye. All of this is magical training. It's training the mind. And I think that the point you make about glass is half empty is my normal state, but when I get in the flow, I see magic happen, is what we're talking about in terms of magical training. You have to be able to train your mind to stop seeing the glass as half empty and to be in the flow all the time. Now, I've been doing that for 25, 30 years, and I still can't do it. Okay, it's something that's really, really very difficult. I'm the worst person in the world. My magical community friends will remind me from time to time, but Gary, you're being negative. You're creating your own reality negatively. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm doing it again. You're so consumed by self in reality that you can't sometimes see it. But this brings me on to another point I wanted to ask you about, which we just mentioned, Hellier. And I binge watched it, as I just told you before we started the call, because what I enjoyed, and some people criticized, was the term synchronicity is used in that so many times, and there is so much synchronicity in it. And to me, when you're in the magical flow, when things are going right and you are really creating the reality and motoring through in the direction that the powers that be want you to go, everything's synchronicity. Everything suddenly starts lining up. How do you see synchronicity?
Synchronicity is one of these experiences we have in life that totally confuses me in many ways. I have the kind of the rational, logical, mathematical idea that it is effectively just the law of large numbers, and it's attention bias and confirmation bias. Rather similar to what we were discussing before, is that if I'm looking for coincidences and looking for synchronicities, I will find them, because my mind is now attuned to seeing these things. And of course, there's the argument with the law of large numbers, isn't there, that particularly in the world we now exist within, where we're in information overload. So our mind is being stimulated all the time, and we're getting information fired at us from so many different areas. Therefore, it is not really surprising that synchronicities will take place, particularly if we are attuned and looking for them. But then you get synchronicities that cannot be explained by that. For instance, the most bizarre synchronicity, I think, in my life is a very, very strange one, in that it's linked to something that is quite popular. It's people seeing the 11:11 phenomenon. That people see 11:11 everywhere. And I'd argue that, and I've long argued, that the whole 11:11 thing is a classic example of attention bias, in that because 11:11 really 4 vertical lines, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we are very much programmed to see things that look out of pattern. And there's very few sequences of digits that will have those 4 lines in such a way. And we suddenly notice them because they're different. And this is something I'd put forward until, funnily enough, my wife, who is not into this kind of thing at all, said, "You're missing the biggest 11:11 coincidence, synchronicity in your life, and you're missing it." And I said, "What is this then?" And she said, "It's the title of the Dutch language edition of your first book." And I realized that it was. The title in Dutch of my first book is called 11:11:11. And it's Dutch for life after life after life.
Good grief.
And the shiver went down my spine. Because that is not attention bias. No. That is something far more profound. That is almost as if we're coming to the cosmic joker idea. The idea that the universe, or whatever we like to call it, whoever's creating my reality around me, put that in there as a joke. It said, I'm going to pull your leg, I'm going to push you into position of rationalizing away something, and then I will throw into the mix something that you cannot rationalize away in any shape or form. And I thought, wow, incredible, simply extraordinary. And since then, I've been far more attuned to these synchronicities. And the synchronicities are extraordinary in my life, and I've talked about them many, many times, and there's no point in really reiterating them here, but they're ones that really I simply cannot explain. And when I was watching Hellier, there are actual synchronicities based upon me watching Hellier, which are extraordinary. And seemingly, this seems to be suggesting to me, it's pointing you in a direction. It's saying that you're on the right track, and you need to follow it. Now, if my argument is true that we have a higher self, the daemon, which is the part of us that has lived this life before, it is effectively our game player within the game of your life. That game player will manifest and create synchronistic events within your life that will ensure that you're going in the right direction, or as warnings. And of course, the problem is we're never sure whether these are warnings or points suggesting you're in the right direction.
Before we go on, just for people that maybe don't know as much about you as I do, can you explain the daemon concept?
Okay, the daemon concept is, it all came out of my first book, Is There Life After Death? And in that, I was I was looking for a scientific explanation for precognition, and a scientific explanation or an explanation that could be used in such a way that it would at least apply logic and sense to something that seemingly is impossible, i.e. how you can know the contents of your own future when your own future hasn't happened. And I concluded that if you have already experienced your own future in some alternate reality or in some other reality, that could then explain it, because then it is not a precognition, it's a past memory. Mm-hmm. And the argument is that when we die, we never get to the point of death. We fall out of time at the point of death. So therefore, our consciousness continues, even though for other people we are seen to die. And when we go into an altered state of consciousness at the point of death, which is what people talk about when they say my life flashed before my eyes as part of the near-death experience, I argue that something peculiar happens with time in a real death experience, and you re-experience your life in a literal minute-by-minute recreation of your life. And in that second life, which is the equivalent of a third-person computer game, I use the analogy of a computer game, that your life is a computer game in which all outcomes of all decisions are already encoded within the 0 point field, within the akashic field, whatever we'd like to call it, in which case your life. Now, the issue then is how you know the future. Well, you know the future because at the point of death, human consciousness bifurcates into two separate entities. It changes into the eidolon, which is the in-game sprite. It's the in-game player. It's the in-game consciousness that every new life, every new game is reborn with no memories of its past existence. But there is part of it that is immortal. It's a part of it that transcends each game. And that effectively is the equivalent of your game player, which is your daemon. And your daemon is your spirit guide. Your daemon is your immortal self. We know this from magical tradition, as you know very well, the whole point of magical traditions is to find the God within, to find your higher self, to interface with your higher self. Okay. I argue that the higher self is the daemon. And in which case then, the daemon will have memories of your past life and will use that information to try and guide you as best it can through the pitfalls of your present life, just like somebody playing a third-person computer game does with its on-screen sprite. Lara Croft, at the start, she's born, she walks down a corridor, walks into a room, is killed by a monster. The daemon will remember that from last time and will ensure that its on-screen sprite doesn't go into that room. And this is how you're guided through life. And this, of course, sometimes there are leakages through from demonic consciousness to eidolonic consciousness. And that's where deja vus take place, that sudden recognition that you've done something before. And this effectively is what I mean by the daemon-eidolon dyad.
You talked about the cosmic jerker, which is intriguing and interesting to me because that there are so many gods in all hierarchies that are tricksters or jerkers. And I don't know how far you got with the program we're talking about. Towards the end, start investigating the concept of Pan as the trickster god, yes?
Yeah, my friend Samantha Treasure pointed this out to me, the person that pointed it out to me that I needed to watch it, but yes.
Yeah, and you said how you'd seen your personal synchronicity in watching it. I did too.
Really?
And that was that I just put out a book called Chasing the Shaman. A lot of things have been going on in my area here, specifically around me, and I had started to take on certain Slavic god forms. I've done Perun, the god of thunder, god of the skies, and I'm moving into Veles, which is the god of the underworld, the trickster, and watching Hellier all the way through. I'm like, oh my God, I'm having the same experience, except in my own world, in my own environment in the Czech Republic, in Brno, specific to me, that they're having in this show. And how can that be? That's ridiculous. Is that sort of happening to you as well?
Oh, yes. I mean, it is extraordinary. And the number of synchronicities that are now taking place in my life is beyond comprehension. Yeah. It is as if my whole world is focusing in. And I believe, for instance, and I always think this now, Gary, you and I are now having this conversation, okay? All our lives have been a series of coincidences and chance decisions in order to get you and I to be having this conversation about Hellier today.
Yes. Yeah.
And subsequently broadcasting it. Now, one could argue that's being very naive because you're going to be somewhere anyway, whatever you do. But you have to say that, that the chances of us meeting in the world with the many billions of people on the planet is quite remote. And then the linkage to Hellier, that Hellier is now showing at the moment. Now, I've been trying to contact the guys who are involved in Hellier, and I've sent them an email, and I've sent them a message on their Facebook page. No success at the moment. And yet suddenly I get a message 2 days ago. There is an associate of mine who actually knows them. And the thing is, the coincidences are now coming together because 2 of my books are about to come out in Greek, in the Greek language. My new Greek publisher down there is very keen to facilitate and help us create a recreation of Plato's cave and the allegory of the cave at the location that Plato's cave took place. And now all the main themes here are to do with darkness. They're to do with what I would argue is the creation of melatonin within darkness, and therefore the facilitation of melatonin and synthesizing melatonin into endogenous dimethyltryptamine within the pineal gland, and the way in which that dimethyltryptamine opened the doors of perception and allow us to attune into the reality behind the reality, what I call the pleroma. And this is what's happening, and I suspect the synchronicities that are going to be happening within Hellier, because friends of mine are messaging me all the time about Hellier. Watch Hellier, you have to watch Hellier. And I'm going, wow, what coincidence is going to happen next? And every time I watch it, I'm writing notes furiously, going, "Oh my God, they've gone there. They've gone."
We're having that coincidence right now, because before we even started recording, I told you, as a result of seeing a Facebook post of yours relating to a thing called Hellier, I decided, that looks interesting, and I actually binge watched every single episode this weekend. So we wouldn't even have been having this conversation if I hadn't have seen you post on Facebook. I mean, and I wouldn't have watched it if it hadn't have been so synchronous with what the hell is going on in my life and my magical world. And I was sat there like, I can't believe what I'm seeing. I just can't. This is like, it's what's happening to me. I mean, it's a different context. It's in a North American Appalachian context, and I'm in a Czech Slavic context, but they're talking about Pan. I'm talking about Veles, the horned god, the trickster. I mean, and I'm being led by this.
Gary, you have just sent shivers up my spine. The reason being that Sam and I have been preoccupied with the concept of the horned god and the concept of the Twin Peaks and the concept of labyrinths. And this is something we've been interested in for around about a year, 18 months. And then suddenly you're talking about the horned god. And I'm going, and my brain again is starting to go, I can deal with it, but I find it so extraordinary, because had Sam not mentioned to me about Hellier, I would not watched it. I wouldn't have even known about it. And I'm interested to know now how she came across Hellier. Yeah. Because she got so excited. She's over in Ontario in Canada, and she got so excited, and she messaged me and said, "You've got to watch Hellier." So I then watch Hellier, and it happens to me. I then post something about Hellier. You watch it with then links into your world, and you've got to think there's an underlying pattern here.
Absolutely,
there is something extraordinary.
They actually say, I think in the summary of the final episode of series 2, how a lot of magical people are telling them they're enacting a ritual, and that this ritual could even be extending to the people who are watching being part of that ritual as well in their own way. And so Hellier could in the end become some huge magical event that triggers all kinds of change. Who knows? Probably getting overexcited. The scientist in me saying that, but
yeah, it's the same as me.
Not.
But then I started watching it, and I said, this is extraordinary, because I've been a huge fan of John Keel forever, since the 1960s, from his Project Trojan Horse book. Mm-hmm. I'm very aware of the tropes of the Mothman prophecies, but also, get this, that I have known about Hopkinsville goblins since 1966, 1967, from soon after it took place. Because I've very much been into ufology. So all the tropes they are bringing up in that program, I have been involved in for over 50 years.
Yeah.
And all the time, it's kind of like this feedback loop. Now, is it because we are in some way directly responsible for the creation of our own reality in some way, and therefore I'm creating the cosmic egregorial principle? I'm creating my world around me, and you're part of this, but you're creating your egregore, which is overlapping into mine, which is then causing this overlap of realities. And I'm collapsing my wave function. You're collapsing your wave function. The guys in Hellier are collapsing theirs. Sam is collapsing hers over in Canada. And it's just like this huge Venn diagram.
We can all personally find synchronicities in there and meaning. From a magical perspective, when you're in the flow, when you're being guided by what you call the demon, synchronicity, the more this synchronicity happens, the closer you're getting to where I think you're supposed to be. And I think there is an element, undeniably, there is an element of synchronicity being you're just noticing things because you're giving attention to certain things that are happening. But again, how do you know whether this is real or just bias, just attention bias? It's very difficult to make the argument, but it goes with a feeling, it goes with a sense of lots of other synchronicities. And when you're in that flow, you really know it. And when you wander off, you lose those synchronicities, you lose what I call the magic. Further evidence for the demon's influence in your life? Isn't this a way that eternal aspect of yourself can guide you to the right path?
Oh, totally. I mean, I feel that I've been guided to write the work. It's been a burning issue in my life. I always knew that I would do this. This is the reason for my being, effectively. Mm-hmm. And my daemon has left me so many clues. And in fact, even the weirdness of the clues, I used a term a couple of days ago, directly from my second book, The Daemon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, which I called Footprints in the Snow. Mm-hmm. And since then, Footprints in the Snow has been everywhere in my life. Somebody, lunchtime, was it yesterday or was it lunchtime today even, on the radio, somebody used, on Radio 5 Live, used that very term, Footprints in the Snow. And I go, oh my God, why? Now, again, would I have not noticed the term footprints in the snow had I not realized it? I'll give you one example that I think really brings home how rooted these things can be, how peculiar they can be. I've cited it many times in other interviews, but I don't think people really realize the power of this. I needed to get hold of a copy of J.B. Priestley's book, Man and Time, when I was doing my research for my first book. I couldn't get hold of a copy in my local library down here in West Sussex. So I had to go to the library and I had to order it from the library, the British Library in Boston Spa. And I then had to go into the local library in Horsham. I had to order the book. I then had to fill the forms in. The forms then went off. So we've got lots of variables taking place here. They then had to process the order. They had to find the book. They then had to package the book and send it back to Horsham Library. Horsham Library then had a few days to ring me to let me know that the book had arrived. They then give me a phone call one afternoon to say, Mr. Peake, your book has arrived in Horsham Library. I then chose another 3 or 4 days before I managed to go in to Horsham Library to pick the book now. And I'm walking away for a second for a reason. I'll be back in a split second because I need to pick up the book in question because I now have my own copy of this particular book. Okay? Now, because I will then read this out to you because this is quite extraordinary. So I'm going upstairs and suddenly my daemon, for no apparent reason, says, go and pick up that copy of Man and Time. So I go inside and I pick it up and literally I flick through the pages at random. Now, Man and Time has 318 pages in it. I flick through the book and I open the page at a random page, and the page is page 91. Now, lying in bed, it's in the evening, okay? Yeah. So I read down the page and something takes my attention. And J.B. Priestley is trying to explain how light travels, and in which case, when you're looking at a star, you're seeing as it was, not as it is now. Yeah. And he turns around and he says, this is clearly illustrated by a figure and an explanation based on it by James A. Coleman in his Relativity for the Layman. Now, J.B. Priestley wrote that this book was published in 1964. Yeah. Relativity for the Layman was published in about 1957. So already J.B. Priestley had at random choose a quotation. I then start reading the quotation, and this is what he quotes Coleman saying. This figure shows the Earth, the star Betelgeuse, in the constellation Orion the Hunter, and Aldebaran in Taurus, the bull. Betelgeuse or Betelgeuse and Aldebaran are 352 light years respectively from the Earth. Also, Aldebaran is about 200 light years from Betelgeuse. Now, suppose there is a blowout on Orion on the night of March the 17th, 2000, caused by Betelgeuse exploding. I turned round to my wife and I said, "What year is it?" And she said, 2000. I said, "What month is it?" She said, "It's March." I said, "What day is it?" She said, "It's the 17th. I said, "What time of day is it?" "It's the evening." So here we had me, all those random events that allowed that book to be in my hand, to be reading an arbitrary quotation that J.B. Priestley had taken from a book written a few years before that precisely, absolutely precisely, not only to the day, but to the time of day I was reading it.
Right.
Now, to me, that was extraordinary.
It is.
Now, as a double extraordinary thing, yesterday, an interview I did with somebody else was uploaded on YouTube. The person that interviewed me was J.B. Priestley's great grandson. So here we have Wheels Within Wheels, and I've just suddenly realised another one. Now get this, if you go onto my Facebook page, literally before I started this interview, I posted something about Billy Butler, who was a guy I did a regular show with on BBC Radio Merseyside about 10 years ago. And a mutual friend of ours, who's another broadcaster, posted about meeting Billy a couple of days ago and interviewing him. Mm-hmm. Billy Butler's producer is called Coleman, and he was my point of contact with Billy Butler, and I've just realised that now.
So my thanks to Anthony Peake, who was our guest today. You can find out more about Anthony by visiting his Facebook page or by going on to Amazon.com and searching on Anthony Peake. That's Peake, Anthony Peake. And I will put some more details below, including some of the references to books mentioned in the podcast, as usual, below the podcast itself. Thank you again for listening to The Magical World of G. Michael Vasey, and we'll be back quite soon. The next episode will be back to looking at various paranormal phenomena, and this time it will be sleep paralysis and the old hag. That will be the next edition. Meanwhile, once again, thank you to Anthony. Thank you to you for listening. Please do like, please do follow, please do promote this podcast. Thank you. Good night.